Hello, and welcome back to episode 1 of the second season of the Vedic Conversation. We're delighted to be back and sharing with you once again. I'm Derrick Yanford, a Vedic meditation teacher based here in New York City, and I'm joined by my Vedic colleagues Anthony Thompson in London and Rory Kinsella in Sydney. We've made a few changes this season, including the way we share our stories, which will now be done live inside the podcast instead of being pre-recorded. Today, it's all about ego. Ego often gets a bad rap in that we are told to keep it under control, as if it's something that needs to be trained and perhaps best kept on a short leash. With an endless list of historical examples of what an ego out of control looks like, there's no doubt that less is more, but is it all bad? In this episode, we discuss the importance of ego and the nuances of its role, each of us sharing our own perspective of how the ego has both served and betrayed us. Have a listen, but make sure to stick around until the end, where we'll offer a practical exercise in how you can apply this knowledge in your daily life. And don't forget, please subscribe to our channel. When I was about 10 or 11 years old, I remember my father saying to me, "You're going to be on Solid Gold." Now, for those of you who might not remember, Solid Gold was a show that was popular in the mid-1980s. And it was kind of like Soul Train in that they had professional dancers who would perform to top 40 hits. And I used to watch it every week when it came on, and I had aspirations to be on the show someday. However, I distinctly remember thinking that would not be possible for me the moment after my father made the statement. The vision that I had of myself was a very limited one, partially constructed from the fact that we didn't have much money growing up. I had just started my dance lessons and wasn't very good, and I couldn't make the connection of how someone in my position would ever be able to make it in that way. I saw myself from the limitation of my current circumstance and allowed that to carry over into the future. And in all honesty, I also kind of thought of my father as not being a reputable source of information, as he was an alcoholic and would often sound off, making bold statements about things that would happen in the future that never came to fruition. So I regarded this as just another one of his sayings. But I also remember one of my sisters stating something about her going to college and me responding right away with, "You're not going to college. None of us are. We can't do that. We don't have the money to do that." And so again, a limited belief that was created by my ego telling me I was a certain type of person that was going to have a certain type of experience. And in hindsight, it's so interesting that I was already convinced of this at a young age, but I think it speaks to the power of the ego. As I got a little bit older, and we started studying the ego in high school, I remember thinking this is something that I need to keep in check. For the ego is somehow this powerful thing that if it gets too big or too bold, could be destructive. And I didn't want to be perceived as a person with a big head or who thinks so highly of themselves. That modesty is a more favorable attribute than egocentricity. Now, as an adult who has just recently turned 45, I still find at times that my ego will speak to me in ways that are designed and shaped from those limited beliefs that were created long ago in my childhood. And looking back at it now, in some ways, I believe the ego was only doing its job, which was to protect me, to keep me from getting hurt. So if I held the belief that I couldn't attain these certain things that other people were talking about as being possible, then I would spare myself from the pain of being disappointed because I never thought it could actually happen in the first place. How clever the ego is. Now, the difference is I have the ability to recognize when that is happening and that I have a choice in terms of the degree to which I participate with what the ego is telling me, which includes the option to disregard it altogether, something I couldn't do when I was younger. And what I've come to realize is that the ego is neither good nor bad. It just is. And it, like everything else, has a role and a place in our lives, but it's up to me to decide what role it does play in my life, my choices, and my decisions. And although it may be powerful in the sense of its desire to keep me out of harm's way, I have the power to override it. And it's ultimately me who's going to decide what I will and will not do, not my ego. And, as I thought of that story and was writing that story, those two specific instances came back to my memory very, very vividly. It's visceral for me. I remember being there because, as I am trying to progress and do other things, I still hear that little voice, those limited beliefs. But no, okay, here it is again, that ego. So it's very relevant, I think, for me right now.
Yeah. Awesome story. I love how you kind of portray it as it's a choice, and it's not that it's good or bad, you just choose whether to follow it or not. And I also love how you point out that you learned about the ego in high school. Like, everyone knows about this thing, and everyone kind of knows that it's not the best thing to have. But we don't have any, well, most people don't have a practice to work on it. You had that kind of discipline thing where you say, I know I shouldn't be like this, I'll try and be more humble. But I guess, yeah, how do you see your meditation practice helping you with that? How do you see it from your point of view?
I think, it was really interesting because there is this negative connotation that comes along with ego, right? Don't get a big head, he's got a big ego kind of a thing. And what I've really come to realize is the ego is the sense of yourself, and that if it does have a grand sense of self and kind of excludes other people and wants to navigate from this position, then I could see how that's unfavorable. But the ego, at the same time, I have to have a sense of myself. We all have to have one. And my meditation practice has allowed me to recognize that I don't have to be led by the ego in the way it kind of seemed like it used to be an automatic response, that I didn't have a choice. The ego was in the driver's seat, and that's just how it went, and that my job was to keep it in check. And now I think meditation, with like a lot of things that it does, has given me that space to recognize, okay, you actually can take the ego out of the driver's seat altogether and put it in the back seat, or put it in the trunk, or tie it to the roof, whatever it is that you want to do, and that it doesn't have to be the driving force. And so it's not a bad thing, and I'm not ignoring it. I'm not saying, okay, it doesn't exist. It's that I recognize it has a place, but I am the one who gives it power. Where, you know, I definitely can see people too and might think, okay, that's an ego driven person. That's an egocentric person. But again, I don't necessarily equate it as being a bad thing, because that's just the way that it's operating inside of that person. And so I think my meditation practice has also taken away the negative connotation around ego. It's not good, it's not bad, it is, and how you use it or how you drive with it makes all the difference.
Yeah, I think that's really important. When I was looking for stories to tell for this, I searched for the word ego in my journal, which has got like 500,000 words in it, and it came up 162 times. But it was mostly in my pre-meditation phase, when I was I started writing my diary, but I hadn't started meditating yet. And it was always, like you said, in that negative context of me realizing, oh, this is ego here, this is ego. I think when you start to realize it, that's good. That's kind of self-awareness. Self-awareness is the first step in development. But like you said, it's not about thinking, oh, that's bad, because then you create loads of guilt around it. And often ego is a slightly overexpressed version of a healthy requirement to, look after your own needs. But yeah, I think you're right in that, meditation makes us feel less bad about lots of stuff that naturally happens anyway. And it really doesn't help our development to feel guilty about those ego things. It's just moving beyond it. So moving from that small self experience into the bigger self experience, which is what we get during meditation. We connect with that silent, bigger, broader state of consciousness, which infuses everything around us. And that means that, like you said, that ego is still there, but it falls into the background a bit more, or you can see it in perspective with, these other people also have their ego point of views, which are all valid, but let's take everything into account.
I think the other thing that I've learned is that, like you said too, maybe it's okay if I'm having an experience that's largely ego driven, that's okay. And that if I so choose to have that, so be it. If I choose to walk around on the earth leading with my big fat ego, the beauty is having this human experience allows me to actually do that. You know what I mean? I don't have to deny myself or feel guilty or bad that, oh, that moment was really driven by the ego. You know what I mean? Maybe the need of the time demanded that I do actually respond that way. It's relevant to do so, or that because I had that experience, I wouldn't be able to have it unless I allowed myself to do it. And so it becomes almost like an experiment. How big can I let my ego be, or how small can I allow it to be? And therefore it becomes this playful thing, enjoyable.
Rory, you made a very interesting point about this kind of the status of the ego. I think, often the word ego is used in a derogatory sense. That, he's got a big ego, or her ego is always at the forefront of everything. We all have ego, but it's just when we notice it, it's usually misplaced, i.e., the ego is too big for that particular situation. So you may find, there's a group of people having lunch together, and then one person starts to dominate the conversation and they kind of control it all, and their ego is playing to the crowd, to the audience. They're kind of feeding off that, and they've just allowed themselves to grow into that situation, and maybe the other people have allowed it to happen too. But I think when we get back to this point of big self, little self, we're also talking about non-duality, which is perhaps a topic for another day. But, the ego is, of course, present, but I would ascertain or maintain or propose that with meditation, what we're trying to do is disengage from the ego, that we become selfless, and that the only self that we're interested in, is the bigger self. That we realize that much of what we do in the small self, with the small self, is futile. It's pointless, and we're feeding a side of ourselves that wishes to be pleased. It's like it has a voracious appetite, and we're feeding it with all the things that make us feel pumped up and confident. And I think, to answer the question that you asked, Derrick, I would say that, meditation gives you the perspective. It gives you the chance to pull back and say, I was a complete idiot there. I completely misjudged it. I was too strong. Or maybe I was too weak. I stood back when I should have gone forwards. And I think what meditation does is it evens that out, so that you don't get an overly played hand in a particular circumstance or situation, that the whole thing becomes much more level, more even-handed.
Yeah, or more appropriate, because no one would say to say Muhammad Ali when he's in the ring, hey, you've got a bit too much ego there, because that's appropriate for that situation, right?
Absolutely.
And I was going to save this quote for my story, but I'll bring it out now. So there's this Jung quote that I've mentioned before, that where he says, the first half of life is devoted to forming a healthy ego, while the second half of life is going inward and letting go of it. So that's kind of recognizing that it's got this trajectory, that it's necessary in the forming of identity, and it's good up to a point. Whereas, it's like you see more ego-driven behavior in probably younger people, for example, 20s and 30s, when you're establishing yourself in the world and you're wanting to stamp your mark, but then it's generally seen that you would let go of that ego a bit more as you grow older. And then when you don't, it's kind of an outlier, like, watching Trump is an example of an older person who hasn't let that ego go.
It's the development of the personality. As your personality is being developed and you're curating it, there comes a point where you're confident about who you are and your place in the world. You don't have to keep proving to yourself or to anybody else anything. And, often it's fascinating when you watch on, well, not perhaps today, but the old talk shows when you'd get an elderly guest, they had nothing to prove. They had nothing to prove, whereas the younger guest was trying to make all these points about how clever they were and how successful they were, and what was going on, and it's kind of tedious. It's really tedious.
Yeah, and it's that you have a clearer view if you're able to let your ego go. You have a clearer view of things because you're not being clouded by how do I make myself look good in this, which is why we normally have older people in positions of power, say in the military or in government, because they're supposedly going to have less of that, so you can more clearly see the lay of the land, not advancing your own agenda. But that doesn't always play out.
Well, the political sort of landscape at the moment, I think, is a playground for sort of infantile adults.
Yeah,
got a lot of grown-up schoolboys running around the place.
Cool. Should we move on to the second story? Anthony, do you want to go next?
Yeah, should I go? Okay, cool. So, as you probably know, for many years I worked in the art market as an auctioneer and then as an art consultant. And I came across a wide variety of collectors. And I noticed that they fell into two broad categories. The first group would actively revel in the drama of the process, looking forward to the moment when they can declare their wealth and status. And the second group is more discreet, not wanting anyone to know that they're active and what they're spending. Both groups are motivated by the hunt, but what they're really interested in is tracking down the object of their desire and then taking it home. And when I was working as a fine art auctioneer, it was fascinating to watch how potential buyers behaved before, during, and after the auction. Some buyers were self-possessed, remaining calm as they got closer to bidding on their dream piece, and others were obviously overexcited and stressed. But the major driver for both groups was ego. I've seen many people pay many, many times more than they originally intended because they got caught up in the action, determined not to let the person over there or on the telephone or bidding on the internet outdo them. They wanted to be the winner. They were going to be the winner. And, fine art auctions are a very public showcase of determination, wealth, status, and ego. If someone's buying something for a notable or world record price, they can be sure that when it's back home, it will act as an endorsement for everything they stand for. They've used all available means to satisfy their ego, often at an eye-watering cost. And I'm reminded of when I was on safari in Kenya, I visited a well-known white hunter who had the stuffed heads of all the significant animals he had killed placed around his house. And this trophy hunter was no different to the people I was working with. Crudely speaking, they were saying to themselves and to the world, I've got it, you haven't. And in the mid-90s, there was a new sort of phenomena that became apparent in the art market with high net worth individuals coming in from overseas to live in London. And often they were highly influential and important back home, but had little or no status here. And there were a lot of art consultancies that kind of were starting up at that time, usually founded by people who had worked at an auction house for a while. And it was when working there that they would meet up with these ultra high net worth collectors and form a professional relationship, which occasionally went on to be a sort of lifestyle arrangement. One way for the collector to make a name for themselves would be to appoint the art consultant to advise them on purchasing something really of quality for a world record price. And this didn't necessarily mean spending tens of millions of pounds. It could be just for several millions of pounds. And as a notable buyer, they'd get invited to gallery openings and private views, and they'd meet people who would pay them the attention they were used to. And the investment kind of worked on several levels. Firstly, they could get their name out there much quicker than if they'd used a PR firm. And secondly, they could maintain the momentum and their visibility by selling the original purchase, possibly for a profit, and then making another one which would put their name back in the headlines again. And, it was a good deal because the collector got the advice to form a notable collection from the consultant, and the consultant got to spend the collector's money, travel around the world, and bask in the associated glory of purchasing important pieces. And every day you can observe people confusing happiness with status because they're running their lives in the belief that they can control the outcome. And when they're challenged by difficult people, situations, or loss, there's an attitude of resentment. It's always the other person or situation that's at fault and has caused the misery. And we all have this sort of innate understanding that life will unfold in a straightforward manner. And when it doesn't, we don't like it. And when we change the narrative of ourselves, that suffering can stop. There are always going to be things that are going wrong, challenges and obstacles, difficult people, but it's not us making the mess. And we can learn something every time it happens. As we become more conscious, difficulties and challenges kind of no longer contribute to our unhappiness. And this may be alarming for some people because that's how they define themselves. As someone once said, those people become a grievance looking for a cause. Our personality or ego is a concept, it's a conceit, it's an act which we spend huge amounts of time and money and effort curating. I sort of think that personality is an image of ourselves, how we think of ourselves, our idea of ourselves. But what I understand of myself is all an act. It's not really me. My conception of myself has no connection with the universe. And once we understand that we're not a separate personality, but an organism that functions with the environment, with nature, then we'll stop making ourselves unhappy. It's when we give ourselves, when we give our nature to nature that we start to thrive. And when we stop and realize that the world is functioning despite our vainglorious efforts, we can relax and lose that sense of self-importance. And finally, I would just like to remind you of something, that today, a rooster, tomorrow, a feather duster.
Where's that from?
An American friend came up with it. Have you ever heard it before?
No.
I love it. It's one of my faves.
A lot of truth in that, you know what I mean? That's
Yep.
Exactly. It's so interesting, I'm trying to imagine the scene that you set up with, even that you're a person that has that kind of money, tens of millions of dollars to purchase an item, and what does their body language even look like walking into that space or sitting in the room, or when they propose a bid? Like, is it larger than you know what I mean? What can you?
It's very theatrical. It's
Okay.
hugely theatrical. And as the auctioneer, it's a little bit like being the conductor. You're bringing people in, you're kind of raising their expectations just by a look or a gesture. You can actually manipulate people to spend more money or wait. And of course, if you ask people to wait because you're taking a bid from over here, they get very frustrated and they think that you're ignoring them. And so you have to pander. There's a lot of pandering that goes on. lot of fluffing, making sure that everybody's happy, which is kind of.
Have you seen those videos of the cattle auctioneers in the US where they
Were
kind of were you doing that? I'm imagining you doing that. 10 million for the Picasso over here. 50 million.
It's a little bit slower than that. Quite a bit slower.
But
I always wanted to sell cattle. I've sold most things, but I haven't sold a cattle or any cattle yet.
the question that arises for me trying to picture that whole scenario is, how does your ego fit into that whole picture, especially if you, let's say, for example, you're in a room with largely ego-driven people. Does that have an effect on your ego too? Like, what happens with you?
Yes, indeed. I mean, if you're the auctioneer, you have to, in a sense, counterbalance this room full of ego. You don't want to overwhelm people. It's a very delicate balance of encouraging people. It is an act. It's definitely an act.
Do you feel like you're competing with them? Like you, as the auctioneer, you have an ego competition with, I have to show you who's in charge.
I am,
me.
as the auctioneer, you're definitely in control.
Okay, I can see.
You're God. You're God. I mean, you can just ignore people. You can wipe people out. You can encourage people.
So is it an ego? Is it an ego trip
understands
for
that.
you? Is it an ego trip for you?
Yes, I think it was when I was doing it in the early days. Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, you felt,
Okay.
It was fantastically exciting. It was terrifying because if you made a mistake, it could be very expensive for everybody, the seller, the buyer, and the auction house. Yeah. I mean, there was, because you are standing on a pedestal, and you've got this audience, which is not just in the room; they're also on the internet, and you may be filmed and photographed at the same time. It's a huge. It's a massive sort of theatrical event. Wow. And one has to be very, very sharp. You have to be, the concentration is right out there, because if you lose the concentration for a moment, it all goes haywire. So yeah, there's some ego, but I mean, I think one realized, everybody in the company knew that the auctioneers, there were different, probably about 20 of us. We were the sort of the actors, if you like, in that scenario. And then when we came off stage, we were just regular guys again.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Going back to the idea of the rooster and the feather duster, I love that kind of idea that the ego is kind of a very temporary thing. So I did a course a few years ago. We were learning about phobias, and it was talking about how all phobias are fear of death, and they're all fear of death of the ego. So I guess in the Vedic understanding, we if we wanted to get a bit more out there and spiritual, we'd talk about how life goes on afterwards, or we rejoin this endless cycle of life, and it's the really temporal aspects of ourselves, the ego aspects that cause us suffering. And I also love how, in the past they were called memento mori, so that reminder of death. The classic one is in Hamlet, where he has Yorick's skull, that he's looking at it, and it's like, alas, poor Yorick, and realizing once we know that we're in this life and death cycle, it becomes easier to achieve what we want, but also to put our egos aside, knowing that there's this wider project going on.
Interesting point.
And there was, speaking of the art world, remember there was that Damien Hirst skull, and it was
diamond encrusted skull.
Yeah, it was valued at £100 million, I think, and it was called, my memory was, it was called For the Love of God. And it was because Damien Hirst told his mum about this piece, and she was like, "Oh, for the love of God!" And he was like, right. "We're gonna call it that."
Yeah.
Wow, crazy.
But I think this interesting point about death is that, which has been made by other people on several occasions, is that what is it that actually survives after death? It's not this corporal being, it's our personality. It's in a sense a taste of our ego that stays behind. if we're using ego and personality interchangeably in that sense, it's our consciousness, our personality, which is there, and that doesn't change. We're changing every 7 years. We're completely new. Every single atom in our body is completely new after 7 years. So who are we? We're not the bones. We're not the hair. Whatever it is, we're our personality, and
or we're the witness.
Or yes, indeed.
Without any of that, maybe we need a later in the day to get into this this depth of conversation.
No,
well, maybe we should hear your story, Rory.
Okay. So I used to be a journalist. In the last couple of years of being a journalist, I was promoted to being an editor, which meant having to face this daily trial by fire that was the morning news conference. And at this news conference, each section editor would pitch their stories that they were planning to cover that day to the managing editor and the editor-in-chief for approval. And it was kind of a cross between this stand-up comedy show with heckling and a medieval trial. And it could be really brutal, especially for those with fragile egos like me at the time. But it was often hilarious, especially if you weren't in the firing line. And I was the features editor, kind of the lifestyle editor, and I'd be at my desk at 7 a.m, creating my story list, which would involve checking all the major news sites, hearing pitches from my team, talking to freelancers, and liaising with the dozen or so magazines that fell into my beat, which was everything from health to human interest stories and funny cat videos, which were big at the time, still are. And on a good day, the 8 a.m. conference was like triumphantly striding into this gladiatorial arena with this giant sword to take on everyone else's puny little nets and daggers. But on a bad day, I'd get massacred. And after any story pitch, people would shout things like bullshit or old. And pitching an old news story was as bad as pitching something that was untrue. This was before the days of fake news. It was just called bullshit then. And it could be quite a stressful environment, and I kind of drank regularly at the time, so I would often be hungover in this meeting, which was not fun. And there was even a word, a phrase in the office which was coined in my honor, which is called Kinsellaed. And if you were Kinsellaed, it meant that you were so hungover at work that you were still visibly drunk.
Oh.
Which I've successfully passed on to someone else, rebranded it as someone else. So yeah, stories that didn't make the grade, either because they were old, boring, or bullshit, or a combination of the above, would be spiked. And spiked is a term from print media where the rejected stories would literally be put on a spike. And after a spiking, my ego would often feel just as skewered as the story. And at the time, I had a tendency for my self-esteem to be dependent on things going my way. And when they did, I felt great. And when they didn't, I could feel deflated or wounded. And I guess if I was in those meetings now, I'd be less attached to the stories I was presenting. I'd realize that it was just a process of separating the wheat from the chaff to make sure that the final product, which was the news offering of the day, was as good as it could be. But instead, I had a habit of taking everything really personally. My ego and my sense of self-worth was tied up with what I was presenting, which meant I was on this kind of roller coaster of success and failure. If a story was picked up and put on the homepage, we would see, digitally how well it was going, and I would bask in its glory if it was going really well. But then if it bombed or I was laughed out of the room, I would kind of follow it too with my tail between my legs, and I'd get really defensive and barely able to conceal my anger, as my boss would often tell me. This anger was because I was overly attached to these stories, and as we were saying before, I didn't have a clear view of what was good or what wasn't, because I had an investment in the outcome of this. And this, that's where my Jung quote comes in that you need to have that that ego to kind of get to the point where you're confident enough to present your own stuff, but then it prevents you, rising, in any job to those higher echelons, because if you're too invested in something, you don't get a clear view. But yeah, I have kind of fondish memories of those those days.
It sounds grueling, really grueling.
I'm actually kind of I don't know. I'm a little bit of anxiety because I was a dancer. I'm used to rejection in the terms of going to an audition and being told no, and sometimes at the very beginning. But it seems much more vulnerable in that arena than I would.
But maybe that was just how I remembered it, because you think about a lot of jobs involve rejection. Like, I've been reading a bit about sales, and sales is a prime job for, if you're thin-skinned in sales, you're going to get knockbacks all day, and your kind of financial reward is completely tied to your ability. So it's like your value is going up and down with your performance, which must be it's probably good, because that teaches you to not be in overly invested in it personally, because otherwise you don't cut it, you leave because you can't hack it.
Well, that's the interesting thing that you said. You use an adjective, fragile, to describe the ego, and I was like, oh, that's so interesting too, because if you imagine your ego to be fragile, that you have to take great care with it because it can be injured, and it's interesting how we personify the ego to the degree to which it becomes synonymous with yourself. It's no longer an aspect of yourself. It actually is you. And this is where the problem becomes, because, I got rejected. My ego, it is one in the same, and it can get hurt, and it can be and have all of these, human characteristics. It's so interesting to talk about it in that way. But I think your story, really brings to life. That's how it can feel in those moments, that you there is no separation. Everyone doesn't like me. You know what I mean? And I think we have part of the ego, or what we have as human beings, is we want to be liked, and we want to fit in, and we want to be accepted. And if we can't do that, if we can't find connection, then it begs the question, what's wrong with us? Kind of, you know what I mean?
Well, I think this is one of the major problems we got at the moment, that people are looking for connection, they're looking for recognition, and social media is the perfect place which fuels that. I've just watched probably the scariest and most disturbing film I've seen for a very long time, The Social Dilemma. I don't know if you've seen that documentary. Mm-hmm. I mean, I know some people who worked at Facebook and left in 2018 because they were so disturbed by what was going on. And if you have a fragile personality, you will find, because the algorithms are all there, the AI is all working to help you find a group of people like you, whether you're QAnon or an incel or whatever your particular interest is. You will find people out there like you, and the system will find them for you, and then you feel okay, however weird other people think you are, however many times you've been knocked down because you're this, that, or the other. You can find a safe harbor within the confines of your screen, and it creates a full sense of reality. And I think one thing that Vedic meditation does is that it, one of the great things about Vedic meditation is that it's not a digital platform. We're not using apps. We're not teaching. We're not giving instruction through the digital platform. We're giving ourselves the opportunity twice a day to disengage from all that and just come back to the fundamentals of who we are, and realizing, as Rory said, that the small self is actually part of the bigger self, and it's the bigger self that's really giving us the sustenance, which will give us the guidance, which will give us the comfort that we all crave. Like you were saying, Derrick, we all want that recognition. None of us want rejection. That we all just want to be heard. It's a fundamental human desire.
I think the other important thing to point out about what our meditation practice does is that it partially tries to convince the ego that it is not only what it identifies itself as being, this small self, but that it is the large self as well. That we, there's nothing wrong with the ego identifying as everything. Because I think what ends up happening is the ego creates this identity based on the outside world, the senses that we have, and then creates a way to stick to that and figure that out. And when we as people realize, okay, that's an aspect of myself, I am the universe. Well, what's better than to convince the ego that it is the universe as well, to make it believe the same thing that we have come to believe, so it doesn't need to act this way or feel bad if it gets rejected, that it's okay, your ego is limitless. And that's the beauty of our practice as well.
I would slightly disagree with that, because I don't think there is any convincing going on. Because convincing suggests effort. And this is an effortless technique. This is a technique where we understand from a position of heightened consciousness that our awareness has got to the point where the ego is just shown, doesn't have to be convinced, it's just shown what the right path is. If you're trying to convince somebody, then you're automatically in a battle. We're not in a battle. We're just suspending the ego. I beg your pardon?
Not non-dual, so there's not like one argument against the other.
It's much more subtle than that, I would propose.
Yeah, I think I mean more like, in my opinion, convincing means it's not something you do to somebody else. You never convince anybody of anything. That person becomes convinced themselves. So if I change my mind, I'm convinced. It's not because you convinced me. It is because the experience itself allowed me to understand there's another opportunity or option to choose than the one that I have been making. So what I meant is, if the ego then discovers through the practice of the practice of meditation that it also is what I have experienced it convinces itself. Not that I'm going to practice this thing so that I can convince the ego that it is something else. And more so that it allows the ego to be in a position where it can become convinced, oh, I'm more than what I thought I was originally. Not something that I'm forcing it to do.
And I think the other kind of important aspect of what we're doing when we're connecting with that bigger self is that we find fulfillment there. So we find that natural fulfillment, and that's to the level even of our body chemistry is fulfillment chemistry. It's serotonin, it's dopamine, so that we're less, I think of it that we become less needy. And you can apply that neediness to whatever your particular peccadillo is. So I was drinking, or the social dilemma aspect of that plays on the reward system. So when we become more fulfilled naturally inside through meditation, we become less needy in the outside world. We need whether that's less likes on Instagram or less $10 million art pieces. we don't need the external world to give that back to us, and that means that we're more stable, because this inner source of fulfillment and happiness is not going anywhere. It's always there, and it will be there if you're in prison somewhere. It will be there wherever you are. It's not dependent on the outside world. And the more we tie our happiness to external events, then we're on that wavy surface layer that we talk about. And if it's stormy, you're stormy. And I had this a few years ago. I bought some shares and got into the habit of checking the share price, and I would check it all day. And if you ever watch the share price, it jumps up and down and up and down, up and down all day, and it can go up, a particular share can go up 10%, 20%, down 20%. And if you're there going, as I was, saying, wow, I'm 10% richer, or I'm 10% poorer. So it got to the stage where I was like, okay, I know in general the stock market's good and it's going up, so I'm only going to check it once a month because I don't need that roller coaster of my happiness being out of my control, and everything that's out of us is out of our control, whereas connecting with ourselves in this very simple way is within our control, and we can control, when we teach people to meditate, we say, look, you now have a way of controlling your conscious experience and in your happiness, because by connecting with this deeper part of yourself, you will realize that whatever is going on is okay.
Beautiful.
I think this desire for external endorsement, is something that we give up, and it's all part of this process of surrendering our preferences. That and it's the ego is the ego wants us to do this. This would be nice. I would be happy when this happens. But when we actually stand back and say, well, actually, in the big scheme of things, it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't make any difference whether I do this or that, or this happens to me, or I buy this or don't eat that, or whatever it is. That surrender of preference creates a sense of ease because you're kind of opting out of playing the game. And that's very pleasant.
Okay, thanks for sticking around to the end. Each episode, we offer a takeaway in the form of an exercise you can do at home to start applying this knowledge into your own life. This episode, we were talking about ego, and we each shared a story demonstrating our relationship and perspective of ego and the role it's played in our lives. We invite you to take a few moments to write in a journal or on a scrap of paper or even just into your phone. Think about a time in your life where you may have been confronted by your ego or the ego of someone else. What did it feel like? What was your reaction? What did you learn from the experience? If you're happy to share your story, we'd love for you to join the conversation. And for those of you who are not camera shy, please feel free to share a video journal of your story with us. You can send them via email to stories@thevedic.conversation.com or simply post them on social media with the hashtag #TheVedicConversation. And if you found value in this episode, please share it with your audience and consider giving us a positive review to help others find us. Also, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already.